I'd like to welcome everyone. Also, thank you for your patience that we're starting a few minutes too late. Let me do all the formalities first. I'd like to thank, of course, the Helle Panke and the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung who have made this possible. I'd like to thank very, very much Richard Murphy for joining us. I'd also would like to say how important, how thankful we are that Florian Skelton and Monika Honegger do the translations. This is not simple stuff, and it's hard work, and they do this. This is not the main source of income. They do this sort of voluntarily. I'd like to thank Sven Buchin, who does all the technical work, and of course, Frank Engster, who just sort of organizes all this, God knows how, but he keeps, it's like herding cats working on these sort of projects. Normally I don't do introductions. I'm doing one today because I don't think the search machines do real justice to Richard. And I'll just try to, that you understand why Richard is so important for us at Brave New Europe, but I think important for everyone, is when we began Brave New Europe, it took a year to research who we'd want as authors. And one of our people who, with whom we launched Brave New Europe, he's still with us, is Nick Shaxson. He said, go look at Richard Murphy's blog. It's great stuff. So I had a look at Richard Murphy's blog. Richard is very, very active. Well, let me tell you who Richard is, first of all. Richard is an academic. He's an activist, definitely, and he's also a prolific blogger, incredible amount. He does about 3 blogs a day. You can find it at Tax Research UK. I read it regularly every day, all 3, or sometimes more, sometimes less. But anyway, so Nick said, look at his tax research blog, and I thought, all right, tax stuff, very interesting. But when I was there, I then discovered something which took me completely by surprise. Richard was writing about the Green New Deal. We're talking about 4 years ago. And I thought, sounds interesting. Looked at it and I said, good God, this is it. We're talking about climate change. People are saying we need solutions. I said, and the amazing thing, this is a group, it was a small group of really just very impressive people. I think there were 10 or 12, Richard?
Originally 8, and it's moved slightly. There's about 12 of us at the moment, I think. And
they really sat down, and it wasn't just sort of, well, we have this good idea, let's have a Green New Deal. They worked it out. It was there. It was all written. It was all worked out. And it wasn't just, we can use this instead of, we can use wind power instead of coal power. They'd gone through really the whole system. And not only that, it had a very social element as well, which was important, critical. And so we said, this is it. If Brave New Europe is going to be on the cutting edge, this is the sort of thing we have to be doing. The only problem was the Green New Deal was almost dead. At that point, we only had Richard and Colin Hines, who I hope has joined us in the meantime. Yes, he has. And Colin, they worked so very, very hard, because we said anything you write on Green New Deal, we will definitely post it. It always has a home, which they did. And the next step was another topic, which we said this is absolutely cutting edge stuff, was modern monetary theory, which at that point was a bit arcane, to be honest. And it was, trying to work through it and understanding it. I was trying to interpret it for the others at Brave New Europe, saying, this is what it's about, but I don't quite understand this aspect and that aspect. And then Richard started writing sort of a popular version of modern monetary theory, making it accessible to a very, very broad public. I think for the first time, what really sort of wasn't just in this small circle of specialists and economists. So this was also very important for us. And then something occurred that was, I found it revolutionary, I still do, is Richard combined the Green New Deal and monetary monetary theory, sorry, into one. And this synthesis just sort of opened the gate to, I think, our future. And of course, it wasn't long after that that Ms. Ocasio-Cortez in America and Bernie Sanders picked up on this and included it in their policy. And suddenly it was there. It was on a very, very broad basis. And since then, a lot of people have built on this. And what I'm trying to say is we have a lot to thank Richard Murphy, who just, sort of a maverick. He's just thinking, developing ideas. And, as Tom Wolfe would say, the right sort of stuff. And so we've had a very intimate relationship with Richard over the years in Brave New Europe, because it's also a very holistic approach. It's always, it's economics, it's politics, it's the social aspects. And, people say, well, he's not left or he's not right. Well, where is he? And I just say, I think there's two words that describe Richard's, policy, which is justice and fairness. This is what's important. And with those two things, you're on the right track. Anyway, with those words, I'll now just pass this on to Richard.
What can I say after that? I want to stop the video and show my sons the introduction. That's it. Look, good evening. Thank you for coming to talk about the Green New Deal. I will try to make sure I speak at a steady pace. I am known to sometimes get excited by my material. I'm excited enough that I wake up every morning and have normally written 3 blogs before breakfast, because I believe there's a world out there to be changed, and so does Colin, who, as we mentioned, Colin is on the call as well. And Colin is sort of my main partner in keeping the Green New Deal group going for a long time. Let's just talk about some history, then what the Green New Deal is, and then I'm going to begin to explore this. I'm well aware that I'm talking to a lot of people here who are in Europe and not just in the UK tonight. And so obviously there are differences between the way in which the Green New Deal will work in each and every country because of history, background, environmental situations, the nature of the properties that are involved, the nature, therefore, of the way in which, different industries are doing different forms of carbon emission at present. There isn't one solution here. So let's be clear, some of the things I'm going to be talking about will not work perfectly in every situation we can look at. You need to be broad-minded. So I'm going to try and talk about some of the theory, some of the ideas behind this, as much as I am about detail, and that's deliberate. Because I'm aware I've got an audience in the UK, I've got an audience in Germany, but translators I know are both Swiss, and I presume that there may be people from other countries, because I've seen how busy Brave New Europe has been about sending out tweets about this meeting, for which I'm grateful. So what is the Green New Deal? What did we come up with and why? The Green New Deal group was pulled together by Colin Hines, and it was made up of, well, Colin, who's an environmentalist, a localist, 2 or 3 former directors of Friends of the Earth, a leading environmental lobby group, which you may be familiar with in the UK. Caroline Lucas, who was then a member of the European Parliament for the UK Green Party, but now and still, unfortunately, it's only Green MP in the UK House of Commons, but one of the most effective members of that House of Commons as a consequence. Anne Pettifor, another economist. Jeff Tiley, who now works at the TUC as an economist. Jeremy Leggett, who's a specialist in peak oil. What did we see in 2007 as a group? First of all, we saw a coming financial crisis. We said the world is heading for a debt crisis. And the reason why to us was fairly obvious. Banks were clearly overlending, mortgages were obviously too large. There was every sign of financial stress in the economy, even though we were being told, don't worry about it. We thought that this was going to fail. And of course, we were right. So we saw a coming financial crisis. We predicted that there would be a crash. We weren't quite sure when, but we were sure there would be. We obviously saw a carbon crisis, and that was around the use of fossil fuels. And we saw a biodiversity crisis, which we actually put into the narrative as a food crisis, because it obviously does translate into that. One of the things we have been doing throughout this whole thing is building narratives. As a campaigner, that is what I do. I often say I've only written about 5 or 6 blogs, but I've written each of them about 3,000 or 4,000 times now. That's a bit of an exaggeration. But I build stories, and that is important for the purposes of communicating complex ideas. And we've done that. We were interested in how do we communicate, how we would get through a crisis if one was to come, which wasn't just a financial crisis, but which was going to require a way of addressing climate, addressing biodiversity, and creating employment. And we wrote a plan. We published the plan in July 2008 in the end. We'd already had sign of crisis to come, because remember, the financial crisis really began in the summer of 2007 in BNP, Banque Nationale de Paris, and with the failure of the Northern Rock Bank in the UK, which have both given signs that there were obviously stresses in place. But we hadn't seen Lehman Brothers. That happened a couple of months after we published our report. And what did the report say? Effectively, we laid out a work program. What we were suggesting then, and which we fundamentally still say now, although this has been refined numerous times in between, and another version has literally been agreed and finalized by Colin and myself now, with the approval of the rest of the members of the group. But we're working on yet another version of finessing it. But what did we say? We said we've got to obviously tackle climate change. We have to control emissions. And there are a limited number of actual major sources of emission. One would obviously be electricity generation and the burning of gas and other fuels to create power. We have to change that, we said. So we looked at how could we change transmission systems. We were looking, therefore, at renewables fundamentally as the answer at that stage. And it's a complex mix. But let's be clear, since 2007, we have seen massive change in renewables. We now know what we were talking about, even then, only 14 years ago, is now deliverable. The change in renewables has been phenomenal. But there are other areas where we haven't seen much change. In the UK, and I know the UK better than anywhere else on this stuff, we really have not made much progress at all about making our housing stock efficient with regard to emissions. So we were deeply concerned about that. There are 30 million properties in the UK. Our argument is we need to make all 30 million thermally efficient by 2030, 30 by 30. Now, that's probably a bit ambitious, but the government is now saying in the UK 30 by 2035. That requires, for example, 20,000 heat pumps to be fitted in the UK per week from now until around 2035. To achieve that outcome, only 26,000 were fitted last year. The scale of change that is being demanded is extraordinary, and yet it's not happening yet. We know we have a long way to go. We were talking about transforming transport. Public transport is our focus. We are all fairly committed to public transport as a mechanism. I mean, I admit there is a car sitting outside my house, but I do as few miles as I can. I live in a rural area. It's difficult not to have a car, but I try to use public transport whenever possible. And that's our focus. But nonetheless, we do need to find alternatives to the car, and which are obviously sustainable. And that won't necessarily be the battery car forever. So we're interested in how do you fund that? How do you build the infrastructure for that transport? How do you build the infrastructure to transform agriculture as well? Because the way we do agriculture is clearly not sustainable. What is it that we need to change to meet the needs of a local economy, which is going to sustain itself? And in all of that, we took on a social agenda as well. Now, a particular problem in the UK is a shortage of rental property for younger people in particular, many of whom are really seriously excluded from the housing market at the moment and are literally, we call them generation rent, because they are trapped into renting unsatisfactory properties on poor tenancy agreements, which are deeply antisocial, which mean that it's very difficult to sustain a family life. That is obviously an issue that we were embracing. We need to build low carbon homes to meet the needs of young people who need housing in the UK. And around all that, What we were also putting into place was this idea that we obviously need the training and support services to make all this happen, because that isn't going to happen overnight, and it isn't going to happen without significant investment in new technology and research and development, but also simply in training. So there's an intergenerational aspect to what we're talking about, which is part of that social justice theme. And that intergenerational aspect is trying to make sure we release resources from the older generation, you know, those who've got this color hair, to make sure that young people have got the opportunity for careers, safe, secure, well-trained, well-paid, union-protected careers that will see them last for a long time in a job that they can do in the locality where they live. One of the things we realized very early on was that we basically need to create what we call a carbon army. Now, the carbon army is the people who are going to transform the local infrastructure that will make it thermally efficient. And those people can live and work near the communities which they're used to living and working in. That's really powerful, because most economic programs are focused upon big business in hubs. We're talking about actually every town and village, as well as city in the UK and beyond, of course, and this could be right across Europe, requiring these trained people. So it's a whole new way of living in that sense, providing people with long-term security where they are. Now, we were costing this back then, and we were talking about how to fund it, and I'm going to come on to the funding. How much is it going to cost? Now, obviously, estimates have got better over the years. We now think that the cost in the UK, and I'm talking in pounds sterling here at present, is between 60 billion, which our climate change committee would say the cost probably is a year at present, and 100 billion a year, which we think is more realistic when you build in all those other training, social and ancillary costs to make this thing really work. 100 billion a year is around 5% of UK gross domestic product. Now, gross domestic product, we all know, if we have any awareness of green issues, is not a great measure of well-being, and it's not a great measure even of income, because actually, when I teach students about what's in gross domestic product, they're absolutely astonished at what makes it up. But let's not worry too much about it at the moment. It gives us an indication of scale. Roughly £1 in every 20 spent in the UK has now got to be spent on the Green New Deal. And I would suggest that that's probably going to be true in many European countries as well. Now, that is, at one level, an astonishing amount of money to find. And at another level, really, only 5%, and we can make our communities carbon neutral. We can change our agriculture to make it sustainable. We can build a world where we can be confident for the next generations that they've got the opportunity that we've had, but certainly I've had. And I think it sounds like an absolute bargain. Unfortunately, we have seen nothing, of course, like that commitment from politicians as yet, particularly in the UK. We're suddenly hearing better noises coming out of the USA than we are almost out of anywhere. You know, thank goodness for Joe Biden, the world's most unlikely radical, you might call him, but that's what he appears to be becoming. But what that spending is required for at least a decade. So we're talking about at least £1 trillion in the UK. And let's assume, broadly speaking, we're talking at proportionate sums in Europe, which means that a 750 billion euro deal is not big enough. Just to give it a clear steer on that, this is not big enough from Europe. There needs to be much more money committed than that. Now, that's a central European fund, of course, and each government will have to respond in its own way. Okay, so let's talk about how we fund this. Now, everything has changed in this, and everything hasn't changed in this. In 2010, Colin and I wrote a paper on what we called green quantitative easing. Before 2009, nobody knew about quantitative easing. That is governments literally creating money through their central banks, or in the case of the EU, creating money through the European Central Bank and injecting it into the economy. Now, the mechanisms for delivery obviously vary within the Eurozone and outside the Eurozone, and I accept that point. And so Switzerland, for example, and the UK have different mechanisms from Germany and France. But ultimately, this is about a central bank injecting money into the economy to fund a government. Now, it can do that funding indirectly. It can do it directly. It could literally give the money to the government. It doesn't. That is not acceptable under EU financing rules. So it's done effectively by a bond buying program. A government issues bonds to the financial markets, and the central bank buys them back. That process added a third element into the government funding cycle. Before then, it was the government was funded by tax and by borrowing, and now it's funded by tax and borrowing and money creation. What Colin and I argued from 2010 onwards, and this was really very novel at the time, was that this new mechanism was going to do three things. One, it was going to create inequality, because if you inject that much money into the economy, there is going to be, as a result of a deficit, some people are going to gain. This is one of the basic rules of modern monetary theory, by the way. Government runs a deficit. There is a private sector surplus. That private sector surplus, as most of us will realize, trickles up. Money does not trickle down in economies. Money flows upwards, and therefore inequality has risen. So that was one of the problems, and we also realized it could be heavily used by the finance sector for speculation. And what we clearly need is investment. So what are we going to do about the Green New Deal? The government could borrow, the private sector could borrow. The private sector doesn't seem willing to borrow because it's not clear about the returns. So we're down to the government. The government can do quantitative easing, or it can borrow itself, or normally combine those two, or the third element we've always talked about is tax reform. Now, when we started, we talked about the sorts of tax reform that the Tax Justice Network, which I have been involved with for many years, although actually I'm not a campaigner for now. I do my work through Tax Research UK, so I'm not TJN anymore, but I was when this process started. That talked about how do we tackle tax havens and all the other things which have been big stories over the years, which I've been heavily involved with as well. Can we beat tax abuse? And now we talk about how can we align, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, how can we align tax reliefs and the Green New Deal? Ultimately, there isn't one answer to this question, how do we fund? We need to borrow, we need to do QE, we need to encourage private sector involvement if necessary by partnering through national investment banks, and here Germany is way ahead of everybody else in Europe, and we need to use tax reform. It's a combination of funding opportunities, but we think that QE is pretty fundamental to this, and we think tax reform is pretty fundamental to this. Now, in 2009, nobody knew that quantitative easing was going to run to billions of pounds, billions of euros, billions of dollars, even trillions. No, we just didn't know that. But now we do. We now know that it works. It can work inside Europe, it can work inside states. It hasn't produced inflation, it hasn't resulted in a loss of confidence in currencies, it hasn't lost credibility for government. Central banks are still functioning. But what there is a situation that's left at the end of this where we know that conventional monetary policy is dead in the water. Interest rates no longer work to control economies. We are in a new world where the post-Keynesian thinking that is implicit in modern monetary theory is effectively the only game in town. And by that I mean, in the future, we won't be changing interest rates to control inflation if we get inflation again, and it's not clear at the moment we will. But if we do, we're going to have to change taxes to achieve that goal. But again, what modern monetary theory says is you shouldn't get inflation if there's a need for the government to spend and there is unemployment in an economy. Now, at the moment, we face real unemployment in most economies in Europe. COVID has created that. It's disguised in some cases. For example, the UK has heavily disguised unemployment at the present. But the reality is, if there is a reason to spend in an economy, MMT says spend because your goal is not to balance the financial books. This is an anti-austerity policy. It is to balance the economy. And the future of economics is going to be aligned with sustainability about creating balanced economies around carbon. So MMT says create the money in your central bank to spend on the necessary programs to deliver what is required to deliver a Green New Deal. But you've also, and this is the twist that Colin and I in particular are adding in now, you have to manage the consequences of that deficit spending. And the consequence of that deficit spending is that we are seeing significant increases in inequality. So what we argue, and I'm going to try and keep this session short enough to have lots of questions because I'd rather have more questions, is that the time has come to think yet again about how to do this. QE is not enough. Our program of green quantitative easing, which reached its maximum impact in Europe when Jeremy Corbyn picked up the idea to become leader of the Labour Party, literally directly lifting it off my blog, to be blunt. That's what happened, and it was incredibly popular and he became leader, but John McDonnell then wasn't very keen on it, so we didn't make any further progress. But then transferred from there, of course, across the Atlantic into the Democrats' thinking, where they have been much more willing to think about linking QE and a Green New Deal, now seen in Biden's policies. So I think you can see Biden's policies literally starting with that work which we were doing in 2007, 2008. But that QE will create inequality. So Colin and I are now arguing for a different variation in our idea on how we use tax. We can use tax to tackle inequality, of course. As a part of the Green New Deal, I would argue that we need taxes on wealth, not because we need the money of the wealthy, because the government can create the money it needs to spend anyway using QE, but to tackle the inequality that QE creates. Tax is not a funding mechanism. Tax is an instrument of fiscal control and social control of an economy. I wrote a book called The Joy of Tax, and the joy of tax is that tax is the single most powerful instrument a government has to control the economy for which it is responsible. So to tackle inequality, we can tax wealth or the income from wealth. And let's be clear, over the last 20 or 30 years in Europe, we've had a dismal record of doing this. Wealth has been massively undertaxed and labor has been massively overtaxed. And at this moment, we want to create jobs. We want to create programs of work to give young people the opportunity for long-term prosperity, which they won't be inheriting. And therefore, we need to undertax labor now and overtax wealth. So there's a basic reason for simply tackling inequality. But we need to do something else. And this is where we're really trying to be innovative at the moment. What we're saying is that we need to reintroduce something which has been almost forgotten. Now, if there are people who've studied Keynesian economics on the call, you will know that there is an equation which is S equals I. Savings equals investment. That is nonsense, by the way. For the last 50 years or so, that has simply not held true. First of all, the money you pay into a bank does not fund loans. As modern monetary theory shows, you don't need to have any money held on deposit in a bank for a bank to be able to issue a loan, so long as everybody trusts each other's promise to pay. So bank loans are made without deposits. They are not intermediaries. They are money creators. But the other fact is that saving, which very often goes into either property or into cash holdings, which, as I say, don't create loans, or into shares, which do not now fund the investment programs of most companies in most countries in Europe, because most companies in most countries in Europe fund their investment programs by borrowing and not by issuing shares. The investments that go into all the various European stock exchange, which obsess financial managers, actually produce no new capital for investment. So in fact, we have broken the relationship in the modern neoliberal economy between saving and investment. What Colin and I want to do is say, let's rebuild that relationship. Now, my research around this is very UK focused, and I apologize for that. But working with Professor Andrew Baker, a colleague at the University of Sheffield, I've shown that 81% of all savings in the UK are in tax incentivized assets. Now, it's a broad range of assets, including people's homes, because we get tax relief on homes in the UK, home ownership. But even if we exclude them, 2/3 of financial assets are in tax incentivized assets, pension funds, and what we call ISA accounts, which are individual savings accounts where a person can save up to £20,000 a year into an account, and basically the income can be paid to them tax-free. These funds have now existed for 25 years or so, and as a consequence, there are now what we call ISA millionaires. people who've put enough money into these funds, which have grown in value sufficiently, they actually have £1 million in these funds. Well, in total, there's £700 billion in these funds, and £70 billion a year is saved in ISA accounts, and more than £100 billion a year goes into pension funds. Now, think about that. What you're talking about there is significantly more money is being saved in the UK every year in tax incentivized savings accounts than is required to fund the Green New Deal. How do we join together that equation? How do we turn the money invested, which is incentivized and paid for by the state, because these savings accounts have a subsidy of £60 billion a year from the UK government, in effect, most of it to pensions, but not all of it to pensions. Those savings need to be reorientated towards investment. And we are promoting the idea of green recovery bonds. Now, the Labour Party in the UK picked this idea up and has promoted it. The Conservative government, without announcing any details as yet, has said it might also look at this idea of green recovery bonds. So we do seem to have some influence on agendas, and we do talk to people, obviously. The point about this is that it would be possible to tie people's savings to provide the funding. So we now provide another form of funding. The government can tax, although we don't think that's the desirable route to pay for the Green New Deal. It can borrow. It can link that borrowing to quantitative easing, which we think is likely to be necessary in part. And we can use tax incentives to redirect the money that is being created by quantitative easing, which is now being saved by small parts of the community, the wealthiest part, towards investment in the Green New Deal. We therefore make it a matter that goes beyond government. The saving and the investment to create this program is now a contractual relationship, we hope, between the generations, between people and government, their savings and their communities. And that is precisely the underpinning logic that we have for the Green New Deal. This is about community building through spending to create a sustainable future. Do we believe that this would therefore be possible? Well, could we find the funding in question, the necessary funding, using this combination, and in particular, releasing private capital to effectively put together the funding that is required for the types of investment that are necessary? Yes, we do. Do we think a government guarantee to back that up would be necessary? Yes, we also think that. But most cash deposits are already guaranteed by governments in the UK at present. And indeed, most cash deposits are guaranteed by governments across Europe at present. So this is not something that is deeply novel or unusual to say there might have to be a government guarantee involved. So that's good news from our point of view. This was going to happen. So we believe that putting these arrangements, which none of which are unusual, together, means that we can find the ways to fund a Green New Deal. I don't suggest we've got a finished article as yet. There will be innovation still to come. Of course, this is a work in progress. It's out for debate. But the point is, this idea, which began in 2007, is very alive. It's well, in the sense it's developing, it's attracting support, and it needs to build this idea that we're working together for a common future. Underneath the whole thing, and right at the beginning, in the introduction, we were talking about what is my political philosophy. Well, my political philosophy, I guess, is social justice. It's a mixed economy approach. I am not totally pro-state. I'm not totally pro-private sector. I don't believe anything is possible without mixing the two together. But I do believe that there is this idea that we live in community. And this is about community building by bringing together the resources of government, private sector, people as labor, people as owners of capital, people who are retired and people who are young, to create a vision for a combined future which is sustainable, which will take us through this crisis that we are facing in a way that will ensure that life as we recognize it is going to survive. And not only will we survive, but actually, I think, flourish. That's it.
Yes, I'm there. Thank you very much, Richard. You even kept to your 30 minutes. Well done.
That was my aim.
All right. We don't have many questions yet, but let's start with the ones we do have. Do you believe that by taxing the top 1%, that it could help contribute to paying the Green New Deal?
I do and I don't believe that. As I said, I think that it is very important that we tax the wealthy because they're wealthy, to tax inequality, because inequality is deeply destructive of any society. The reason why it's inequality is that actually destructive is that actually the wealthy don't spend. I mean, it's not difficult to work that one out. That's why they're wealthy. They don't spend all their money. It follows that therefore they don't spend. And if they don't spend and that money is increasingly concentrated, we actually get a society that is increasingly financially wealthy, but actually poorer in terms of what it can deliver, because not enough money is being paid back into the community to circulate to provide the wealth and income for most people. So therefore, we need to actually reduce inequality to make sure that there is sufficient circulation of money within a society without having to overtax anyone else. So it is a program of economic justice that requires that we tax the wealthy more than anything else. Is it a funding mechanism? Well, in a sense, no. If you understand modern monetary theory, nothing is in fact funded by tax, because the government can always create money. But what it does need to do is take money back out of the economy to control the inflation risk of money creation, and nobody wants inflation. And despite all the stories you might have heard about modern monetary theory is going to lead us to, always said in the UK, the Weimar Republic or Zimbabwe or Venezuela, those are the three examples we are always given. In fact, modern monetary theory is pretty obsessed with controlling inflation and uses taxation to do that. And one of the ways to do that is a tax on the wealthy. So we need this tax. We need a more progressive tax system. We need the social justice implicit in it, but we need it to control the fiscal sector rather than actually to directly fund the Green New Deal. But the two hang together as one integrated policy. One of the things that I do when I'm thinking about economics is always thinking, how does the system as a whole work? One of the faults of most economics is it thinks about little bits at a time. I can hold up in front of you 2 teacups. Most economists would think that they are separate cups. I think, no, they're one whole. They're parts, but they relate together. That was the old teacup I had at the start of this, and my wife has just brought me another cup of tea to keep me going. So, but they're whole. They're the tea that's going to sustain me through this talk. They're related. We have to think about all aspects of an economy as related in that way.
All right, next question. Are there limits to the use of QE? Surely we can't limitlessly create new money.
Well, it's a question, it's an odd point to make, because I have never heard anyone say, is there a limit to the amount of money that private banks can create? There is no rationing system in existence in any country in Europe that says banks may not create money. And yet, it's a simple, straightforward statement of fact that private banks in every country in Europe make money every single time they make a loan to a customer. When they advance you money on your credit card, when they advance you money on your overdraft, when they advance you money on a loan to buy an asset or a mortgage or whatever else, they create money out of thin air. It is literally the promise that they will pay whoever you instruct, and your promise to repay them that makes the money. All money is just a promise to pay. So I've never heard somebody say, oh, let's get really worried because banks are going to suddenly topple the whole economy by creating too much money. But people do worry about whether the government can create too much QE. No, it can't create too much QE. It shouldn't create too much QE, and there is a limit to the amount of money that can be created. And the limit is simply when we've got to full employment, when every useful task that could be done to deliver the government's economic policy is being done, and the private sector is using all the remaining resources in the economy, we have to stop creating money, because then we get inflation. If we don't stop creating money at that point, we have to put up taxation to control inflation. Because people don't like taxes rising, it's better to stop creating new money. So there is a practical limit, but the practical limit moves from being money creation to being full employment. Full employment is the real constraint that we can see easily within the economy. So when you've got everybody working, and I would define that as being working in a job they want at a living wage, then you've reached your limit of practical economic expansion. Stop creating money or you're going to give yourself a problem. That's the limit to QE. It's real, but it's not, as the question implies, oh, there's a finite amount of money we can have. No, there's a finite amount of economic activity we can have, which is much more important.
Next question. Please explain again how it is that QE created inequality.
Johanna, look, how does QE create inequality? QE injects money into the economy. Literally, it is newly created money. If you went to the, and I think you're in the UK, if you went to the website of the Bank of England, its description of quantitative easing is creating new money. That's what it does. And that new money is used to buy government bonds, but the money remains left in the economy as a consequence. And actually, it's been necessary to substitute for the fact that commercial banks have, over the last decade or so, ever since the global financial crisis, not created enough money to keep the economy going. So the government has created money right across Europe, right across the USA, right across the world, has created enough money to generate sufficient economic activity to create something approaching, on occasions, full employment. But, and this is an absolutely fundamental point within modern monetary theory, when the government runs a deficit, and you don't use QE unless the government is running a deficit, because QE is intimately linked to the issue of bonds, and bonds are only issued when there is insufficient tax income to cover government spending. So the two are all linked together. When QE is used, then the government is running a deficit. And when the government runs a deficit, it is effectively spending money into the economy, which remains in the private sector. The reality is that what then happens, the original recipient of that money, that might be somebody on benefits, that might be a teacher, that might be a nurse, that might be a civil servant, doesn't matter what we're talking about, whoever the state paid recipient of that money is, they will also spend it. They'll pay some tax on the way, but the recipient spends it, and so on. This is the Keynesian multiplier at work. But what we also know is that some of that money will be saved along the way. And the people who will be saving money along the way will be those who are wealthy, those who literally do not need the money they are paid to live on. And the fact is that the savings multipliers all tend to cascade upwards. And so the more money that you inject into the economy from the government, the greater ultimately the wealth of the 1% becomes. The fact that QE creates money by deliberately injecting it into the financial markets, that is its weakness. I would prefer it was injected through national investment banks, because I think that's substantially more effective, because it would then go directly towards the goals that we've got. And indeed, this is part of the Green New Deal, which I haven't mentioned. The investment should go through national investment banks to go directly into green activity. But because at present QE goes into financial markets, which are dominated by people who are already wealthy anyway, they even shortcut the process, and so the inequality is increased. So QE is inherently a creator of inequality, which we have to address through taxation, in my opinion.
Right. The next question may need a little bit of interpretation due to it was in German, it's in English. How do we take away the incentive of producing products, energy, jobs, etc., as it is already the traditional way, and reimagine the economic system? What is a green economy? How is it going to be different than the current consumer economy that we have?
Okay, there are a number of answers to this question. And I could spend for the rest of the night and probably until 3 o'clock in the morning, your time or my time, I don't care which, talking about this one. So we might have to cut this one short. There are a number of ways of achieving this. One, of course, is simply regulation. We say, you cannot now produce certain things. And we're getting quite good at that. The amount of coal that is being burned is being reduced by regulation. We are directly choosing to incentivize certain forms of behavior. So governments can subsidize certain forms of behavior. The reason why we are seeing solar power increasing in the UK and wind power increasing, and I know it's true in Germany as well, is that governments have chosen to subsidize those products to make sure that they become cost effective. Now, renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy production in the UK. In 2007, when we were starting writing about this, it was a long way from being the cheapest. So government subsidies are one way to achieve this result. But so is regulation, and so too is also the regulation of companies. Let me explain one of the ideas I'm working on about this at present. Working through financial markets, which are suddenly becoming very aware of environmental risk, we need to put regulation onto companies to affect their behavior. I have created something which I call sustainable cost accounting. This is a new accounting idea. It's the second major accounting idea I've had in my career. I also created something called country by country reporting to address the abuse of multinational companies using tax havens. In 2003, I was told I was mad to have that idea. It's now a law in 70 countries around the world. So I've been here, done this before, creating an accounting idea to change behavior. Sustainable cost accounting would say to companies, by law, and it's entirely possible that this could be delivered, you must create a plan for eliminating your carbon emissions from your company. You must do that by a chosen date. I would choose 2035 at the latest, but each government would have to make their decision. You must have a plan to achieve this, and you must publish it. What is more, you must tell us how much it costs. So you must work out the cost of eliminating carbon from your systems, not the cost of the carbon. We're not pricing carbon here. We're eliminating the cost of eliminating the carbon. And that's from your bought-in electricity, your bought-in materials, your own processes, and what happens in your customer chain. In other words, for example, if you are a supermarket, you are responsible for the emissions that the consumer makes when they consume the product you've sold. How are you going to eliminate all those stages? It's critical that we have all the stages. Otherwise, we end up with something as absurd as we have in the UK at the present point of time, where Gatwick Airport near London claims it's a carbon neutral airport. Now, that is farcical because, of course, it may not have any, it buys all its electricity apparently from renewable sources. That's fine. It generates its own electricity using the buildings at Gatwick to cover its own emissions inside them. But of course, its whole business model is about putting aeroplanes into the air, which pump vast quantities of carbon into the atmosphere. So of course, it's not a carbon neutral airport. It's nonsense. So they are not talking about what is called in these terms their scope 3 emissions. This is under the International Greenhouse Gas Protocols. I can get really boring about environmental issues if you really want. And we need them to eliminate these. It would be entirely possible to have an accounting regulation that says do that. And if the company couldn't work out how to eliminate its carbon emissions by the chosen date, my suggestion is that company should be declared to be carbon insolvent. That literally means it would have to wind up its affairs by the chosen date and cease trading because it couldn't work in a carbon neutral way. Now, does this sound tough? Yeah, sure. It looks pretty bad for airlines. I admit right now, this does not make many airlines look as though they could survive sustainable cost accounting. So maybe governments might have to license some planes to still fly, maybe some. Maybe that's deemed necessary. They might also have to license the use of carbon offsets because all the people around the world are claiming they're going to do carbon offset by planting trees. There's not enough space to plant all the trees for the offset that people claim. And all the oil companies are claiming they're going to do carbon storage and capture. Well, they're not because nobody knows how to do it yet. So actually, we wouldn't let them claim a technology which hasn't been proven to work. Now, this would force companies, first of all, to invest in those technologies until they worked, because they'd have to remain viable, or else they'd have to cease trading. And it would force them to invest because we'd ask them to put this cost up front on their balance sheets and tell the world, how are you going to manage this process? So instantly, the world's capital markets would know which companies are likely to survive and which aren't, who should get capital, who should not, which products should be invested in and which shouldn't. That's what accounting is meant to do. I started my career, I still am, a chartered accountant, a professional qualified accountant. I use accountancy to change behavior. I'm not interested in reporting with accounting. I'm interested in numbers changing the way we live. I could use accounting to literally solve that problem. I could force the products which make carbon out of the market by simply saying companies can't make them because they will go insolvent if they do, and that would force this change through.
So from Patrick Wiggins. Thank you, Richard. A really interesting talk. You rightly say that GDP is a poor measure of an economy's progress. For technical reasons, and as it says little about general well-being, do you have any thoughts on what measures we should use to measure the economy?
You know, this is thank you, Patrick, for the question, and it's a good question. And it's one I have not spent much time working on. There are people who know vastly more about this than I do, who spent much more time thinking about it. And, you know, go and read some of the things around donut economics and, you know, what Kate has done and everything else. You know, think about that stuff. But fundamentally, what we're trying to measure is the positives to well-being and treat the negatives to well-being as being deductions. You know, when I talk about the idea of GDP with students, I explain to them that there are two very easy ways in the world to increase GDP. One is to take a giant supertanker and crash it into the shore of your country, spilling the maximum amount of oil possible, because it will take years and years to clear it up and employ vast numbers of people. There will be absolutely no net social gain to your country. There will be significant environmental costs, but your GDP will rise. And the case study for this is actually in Alaska, where the Exxon Valdez massively increased the gross domestic product of Alaska for several years because a supertanker was crashed into their shores, and that's what happened. The other perfect way to increase GDP is simply to get every single person in the country to divorce, because divorce is an incredibly expensive process with regard to the legal costs, and then with regard to the cost of setting up new households and all the costs of separation. It is a process that creates human misery, but it massively increases GDP. Now, of course, I'm not being serious with either of these suggestions. What I'm pointing out is how absurd the measure is, because we simply apply a positive sign to every single expenditure. What we actually need is to have a measure which applies negatives to those things which reduce human well-being. Now, is that possible? Yeah, of course it's possible. I mean, I've got books back on my shelves up here. There's a chap called Richard Douthwaite. I've got a couple of books by him up there who was writing about this in the 1980s. Robert Kennedy recognized, you know, this in the 1960s before he was murdered, assassinated, when he was running for president. He realized that GDP was a terrible measure of well-being. It measured nothing of value and nothing of importance. And it ignored everything which was really of significance in our lives, he said, and he was right. So we need to come up with better accounting systems. Have I spent much time working on those? No. But do I know we need to do it? Yes. Have I therefore got the answer to your question, Patrick? Not precisely. But the clear idea is that we have to have positives and negatives when we assign value to spends, because some of them are very definitely negative for our well-being.
So you have Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung in Hamburg. Does your combination of MMT, modern monetary theory, and the Green New Deal ultimately rely on decoupling GDP from the emission of climate gases in order to tackle climate change? So this is more or less what you just spoke about.
I think it is pretty much what I've spoken about. Obviously, we need to have this disconnect. There are problems. I mean, let me be clear about one of the problems, and I think this is maybe implicit in this question. So forgive me if I am assuming what the question might be asking, and I don't know whether the question was asked in German or English, but there is a problem, and I will recognize it, and I've mentioned it. We need in the UK 25 million heat pumps, maybe not quite that many, 20 million heat pumps. Every one of those heat pumps will require steel. Steel requires carbon emissions. We have not yet learned how to create steel without emitting carbon. Mittal Steel very proudly said at a conference I was at a couple of years ago that they were going to make steel by 2050 without carbon emission. And when asked, how are you going to do it? They said, we don't know. Which I felt was a fairly pointless contribution to debate, which is precisely one of the reasons why I was promoting sustainable cost accounting. If you can't explain how you're going to do it, you're bankrupt in these terms. You know, you literally, Mittal, on that basis, without knowing how it was going to become net carbon neutral, was a bankrupt company. I don't know whether it's made progress in the meantime. But I am aware that there will be some activities that will be undertaken to deliver the Green New Deal, which look like, in conventional terms, economic growth. And that will include building the new transmission mechanisms, building some of the new transport mechanisms, certainly building the new processes that are implicit in making houses, where we all live in various ways, and obviously different systems will be required for different types of housing, and different areas have different needs, but making them thermally efficient. So we have to look in that process and say, is there literally within the process a carbon offsetting? So the creation of the heat pump has implicit in it the offset of the saving that it generates by not burning fuel thereafter. So we are talking about some quite complex ideas in terms of literally carbon accounting here. I'm afraid to say accounting is really one of the sexiest, most interesting, exciting things that anybody can get into over the next 30 years with regard to carbon. You know, people don't think that accounting is sexy and exciting. I promise you, it's really, really important when it comes to changing the world. And that's part of my answer to your question. How do we decouple it? Depends upon how we measure and count it. Because it looks as though we're going to create more carbon in the short term in some of the things we're going to do, but we have to be aware that we're doing this to create a long-term benefit. There's a trade-off. What we have to learn about is how we make sure we've captured those costs and benefits correctly, not in the conventional cost-benefit analysis that will be talked about in a standard university business school, but in the way we think about in carbon terms.
To what extent is it possible for social justice and equality to go hand in hand with today's finance economic sector? It seems to be profit-centric with little regard for morals and humanity.
I am a deep critic of today's finance economic sector. I mean, let's be blunt about it. I am not a critic of private sector business activity. It would be deeply hypocritical of me to be so. I set up my own firm of accountants when I was in my 20s. I have run real commercial businesses, some of which have most certainly been carbon polluters before I realized how bad that was. I have made profits. I have sold businesses. So look, don't tell me I'm a hypocrite by saying I criticize the system. I do criticize the financialization of the private sector. And this is very different from the private sector itself. When I was an accountant in practice, and that was my main source of income, which it was for around 20 years, my clients often used to wonder who they hated the most with regard to their business. Was it the tax authority or was it their bank manager? Because they were the two people who they felt imposed the biggest constraints on them. Actually, most of them saw the benefit of paying tax at the end of the day. They were a bit grudging about it, but they'd pay their taxes. And perhaps I chose my clients with care. I did. It was a very socially orientated practice. But very few of them liked their bank manager. And why didn't they like their bank manager? Now, I know German banks tend to be a lot more enlightened in their relationship with smaller businesses than UK banks are. I stress, I know that difference. The Sparkassen and so on are very different from what we have. But what they disliked was the pressure to make money to service the bank above all else. We have a problem because in the financial sector in particular, we have seen the diminishment of capital. And this is really quite surprising because we talk about capitalism, but actually capital is very scarce. In most countries, again, Germany tends to be better than this, than average in this compared with most countries in the world. The amount of capital invested in businesses is very low. The amount of borrowing is very high. The orientation towards, therefore, servicing debt is significant. The obligation to keep earning profits, to keep the bank happy by paying the debt, is dramatically, it's the biggest pressure there is on many companies. So financialization has captured business and made it the servant of the bank. It's perpetuated the idea that growth is the only way to go. And it's pretty much been translated into the personal lives of people as well. I believe the whole advertising sector exists to simply make people miserable in the first instance. It is the only profession there is whose goal is to instantly make you dissatisfied with anything you've got. Therefore, it is only dedicated to creating misery. Because the moment you've bought a product, they will produce a new one to tell you that your old one is now no longer any good. But what they also are doing is encouraging you to buy the latest one, even though you don't need to replace the one you've got. That's, of course, not sustainable, but it does increase the amount of debt that you take on. So you become a debt slave. In the UK, the word we have for the loan to buy a house is mortgage. And mortgage literally means a slave to debt. Mort is death. You are enslaved by debt. And this is the risk that we face. So the financial system is designed to literally service the return, not to capital, but actually to what in economic terms we call rent, interest paid to the rentier, the owner of the debt. And that to me is pretty dire. And I've realized that I really do need to go and turn the light on. So before we have the next question, the sun has definitely set in England.
All right, the next question, you're going to have to bear with me. It's a long one and it's in German, so I'm going to translate it. Banks can only create new money when there's a business when there's a business which needs to borrow.
Yeah. I can read a little bit of it, so I'm struggling, but I can sort of get it.
All right. It is also the real economy with its need for credit that sets the limits to which a bank can create new money, right? So if there's a need. Banks create, in this sense, does not create money out of nothing.
That's Geld aus dem Nichts, yeah?
Yeah, kein Geld out of nothing. As long as the companies do not have any profit promise, abilities, they will receive no money from the bank, and thus no money will go into the real economy. How does MMT deal with this? That the money.
Okay, I think I get enough of the gist. Look, let me answer that in the way I think I can understand the question. I can read it. I can read a little bit of German. Yeah. I can't speak much, but I can read more than I can speak. So what we're talking about here are two different ways of creating money. There is the private sector cycle of creating money, which is private banks dealing with private sector customers, whether they be businesses or people. And then there is the government money creation system. Now, if the question starts with the private money creation system from banks. Now, no bank lends you money unless it thinks you can repay. Go back to what I said. Everything is about the promise to pay. So you can't go into a bank and say, I want a loan, without the bank checking out your accounts if you're a business, your credit record, whether you're a business or an individual. They will say, let's see whether you have fulfilled your promise in the past. Effectively, this is why credit agencies are so powerful. And so they will check your ability, your promise to pay. If you can't fulfill your promise to pay, they're not going to create money for you. End of story. So the end of the first half of the question is, how can they make money in effect by lending to people who can't repay? They don't. They won't lend you money if you can't repay, because there is only then a bad debt, and there is effectively a failed contract. And because they have settled their obligation to somebody else for you, because their part of the promise is that they will pay whoever has borrowed from them, the person they instruct. So if I go into a bank and say, I want to borrow £10,000 to buy a car, they will pay the garage or whoever it is who sells me the car. That transaction survives. They still have an obligation potentially to somebody else to settle that, but I have broken my part. So they don't want to see those promises mismatched and broken. So the reality is that banks don't lend unless there is a source of profit or a source of income. The threat to the bank is when that is disrupted. And we've seen this in the last year. We have seen COVID potentially bring entire banking systems across Europe down. The reason why governments across Europe of all types in all countries have had to step in and support their economies to the extent that they have with instant measures. I mean, Germany did this very well, better than the UK did, standing in to help smaller businesses, provide them with loans to keep them solvent, to keep their staff employed, to make sure that the self-employed had a continuing source of income when they couldn't work, and when people were isolated, they could still afford to pay their bills. The reason why they did that was not out of generosity. It was not even out of a great degree of care for those people, although that was, of course, how it was dressed up. It was actually to prevent the banks going bust. Because if people didn't have money to pay their bank bills, if companies couldn't pay their bank loans, then the banks were going to collapse and we were going to see a 2008 crisis times 10. It was going to be so much bigger than happened then, it was going to be unimaginable. So the intervention was, of course, to help people, but it was also to keep the financial system going. What is the difference between that private money cycle, which is under government license? Because remember, you can't be a bank without a government license. So it's all under government control at the end of the day. But what's the difference between that cycle and the government cycle? The government cycle does not have somebody, when it spends money into the economy, who promises to pay. It doesn't have to have somebody who promises to pay because it can enforce payment. And the enforcement of the payment is through tax, of course. Now, tax can be backed up by law. That is one of the powers that we give to government. As citizens of states, we're not citizens in the UK, we're subjects, but as a citizen of Germany, you have to agree to live by the rules of the society you live in. Give or take, we all break the rules a little bit here and there, I suspect, somewhere or other, but I'm not going to go into personal details now, and I'm not going to ask anybody else to, but paying our taxes is one of the obligations that we have to fulfill if we are going to live in a society and we don't want to be caught and penalized and imprisoned or whatever else. The state can quite literally impose its will on us. So it doesn't have to ask somebody to pay, it can enforce payment. It is, however, that power to impose tax that, of course, actually as a result, gives government money its value. The government spends it. It has to create the money in the first instance, because if it didn't create the money, there would be no money available to make the payment of tax. But once it's created the money, it wants it back to prevent inflation. That has always been the case ever since, times of old when this was gold. You didn't want to spend all your gold and then not see it back. The king, queen, whoever it was who was ruling, emperor, wanted their money back. So they imposed a tax to recover their gold. Now the government does this to control inflation on the basis of promises to pay. There is no gold in the system, but the principle remains the same. So what we're doing is actually requiring tax be paid. But by requiring that tax be paid, and because tax is such a significant part of our expenditure, for most of us, it will be well over a third of our incomes. Whether we are wealthy, whether we are poor, the taxes will be different, but it is quite likely that we're paying around a third of our incomes in tax. Different taxes, I say, but nonetheless, broadly speaking, the same ratio, certainly right across the income brackets in the UK. Because that's the case, we will use our local currency for all our transactions. We will trade in pounds in the UK. We will use euros in Germany and francs in Switzerland and so on. And as a result, that currency gets its value, and that is the power which the government has to impose its will, and which in MMT theory shows where the value of money it comes from. Now, some people don't agree with that, but I personally can't see another argument, because I genuinely believe spend always comes first, because if you didn't spend first, how could you pay the tax? It wouldn't be any money to pay it with. So it must be spend first and tax second. I hope that answers that question, but it is quite distinctly different between the private money cycle created by commercial banks and the government money cycle. At the end of the day, you can't tell which pound came from, or which euro came from which cycle, but they are different cycles.
All right. Would your accounting proposal mean that carbon taxes were less or perhaps unnecessary?
I hope it would mean that they would certainly be, if not unnecessary, lower. Carbon taxes do worry me. I mean, I've spent years talking about tax to people. I wrote a book, The Joy of Tax. I have a reputation for liking tax, but actually I'm not very keen on carbon taxes. And I'm not sure they're the answer to the the climate crisis. And that's because they are regressive. The simple fact is that carbon taxes are going to be imposed on many of the most basic commodities that we consume. If they are imposed upon the basic commodities that we consume, and those who have the lowest incomes have what is called the highest marginal propensity to consume. In other words, they spend all they get. Let's be blunt, that's what that means in straightforward terms rather than economic language. Then the highest overall rate of tax with regard to carbon taxation is likely to be paid by those on lowest incomes. And we can see that already. I mean, as I just said, the people who are on lowest income in the UK actually pay taxes overall at the same rate or even higher than the wealthiest. And that is because they pay more value-added tax, they pay more tax on carbon because it's implicit in, for example, fuel costs. They pay more tax on alcohol and tobacco and other things which carry indirect taxation. And indirect taxes tend to be deeply regressive, and therefore those on lowest incomes tend to pay the most. I do therefore have real concerns about carbon taxation and how we compensate for that. I know there are ideas around carbon dividends and so on. I'm not dismissing those, but if we can find a better solution, which is to actually simply force the issue to change the product before we ever have to do the tax, I would rather do that than instead of having to deal with the inequality that carbon taxes could create and then create compensatory mechanisms, which are difficult. I mean, I understand universal basic income. I've spent years looking at universal basic incomes, how we could compensate through such mechanisms. There are some advantages to having a universal basic income. They would have certainly made the delivery of support for society in the COVID crisis easier in some countries because, for example, in the UK, the government simply doesn't know who lives here. And so it can't actually pay a basic income because we don't know how to pay a basic income. So they could have made things easier, but overall, I believe that there are better mechanisms than carbon taxes to manage the climate crisis. And I believe the Green New Deal, the ideas I'm talking about, and accounting change might be better than carbon tax.
All right, the next question is very political. So, for the last 40 years, during the entire period of dominance of the neoliberal idea in politics, the decisive politicians were agents of the top 5%. And not of the bottom 95% of income earners and wealth holders. Why should the decisive representatives of national politics change this position of patronage politics for the wealthy minority in the future? Why should the representatives of the previous policy change their views overnight and align their patronage policy not with the interests of the wealthy, but with the interests of the economically weak, which I'm sure is a very interesting topic because you've been writing a lot about the increase of corruption right now in Britain.
Yes. Look, I'm not sure it's 5% and 95%. It may be 1% and 99%, but let's not get too worried about that. We do definitely have a political process that is captured for the benefit, not of a middle class, but of a definite, very wealthy part of society. And I don't think that's really different across many countries in Europe. Obviously, the decline of social democracy has been a part of that problem. And the decline of trade union power, which I really, really regret, is clearly a part of that problem, because the countervailing points of power within society, which once existed, do not now exist to actually challenge this authority. So we've had the neoliberal era. Why is it going to change? Well, let me come down to one reason why it's going to change, and just give you a really hard and straightforward fact as to why the finance sector wants to take green seriously. Almost all lending by the finance sector is made on what is called security. In other words, they want some form of charge, that's a financial charge, a mortgage, or however, I don't know what the word is in German, so I can't, but I'm sure somebody will be translating it. They take a security on a piece of property, land or buildings, in the case of large companies, to secure the lending. This is commonplace throughout the financial system. I saw a recent survey which reckoned that 80% of the buildings that are used to secure the lending of large companies around the world, of the largest commercial banks around the world, will be underwater by 2060 unless action is taken on climate change. The City of London will be flooded regularly unless we take action on climate change. Rotterdam will be, Amsterdam will be, Paris will be. These places are not secure because rising water level will create problems in Europe. It will create problems right across the east coast of America. So therefore, the financial system literally sees its whole business model collapse if it does not prevent climate change. The security for its lending literally disappears. The assets which underpin its own value have gone. So when we say what is their incentive, well, actual self-preservation or financial preservation is implicit in this. Oh, and by the way, the Cayman Islands will also be underwater, which is, debatable as to whether this is a problem or not. But, I must respect the few friends I have in Cayman. So maybe that's a problem. British Virgin Islands will leave them apart. But, there is clearly a problem here. And I'm joking, by the way, about those places. But, this is obviously a crisis that actually affects everyone. I recently presented this question to a very senior person in a very large financial organization in the UK. And the senior person was the chief executive. And the organization, I won't disclose, I don't think it'd be fair to. And I was quite surprised by this person's enthusiasm for some of the things that I've been talking about at a meeting where we were discussing accounting issues around sustainability. And I said, why are you interested in this? He said, because my children give me no choice. Because I will outlive anything to do with climate change, but they will be affected by it. And I think that this actually is a common human narrative that is beginning to be developed here. I don't believe rich children can buy themselves out of this. Some do. Some are stupid. Some will pretend that they can go and live in New Zealand forever and it won't affect them. They're wrong. Actually, this is going to affect everyone. So they will eventually buy into it. Will all of them buy into it at the time we want? No. Will we have to drag them to make changes? Yes. Are we in the UK, for example, seeing Boris Johnson's government doing anything really meaningful about COP26? No. But then we're not seeing Boris Johnson's government do anything meaningful about anything except corruption right now. I never believed I could say that our Prime Minister was corrupt and be completely confident I couldn't be sued before now, but I know for what I can because he's corrupt. I mean, it's just proven. So I'm not worried about being sued about it. This is a totally new idea that I can actually say that about a prime minister and feel completely legally relaxed about it. I would never have done so before. We are in political era which we've not known. Do I think that this era of populism, which we are suffering at the moment, is going to survive? No. Why? Look, Biden's already proving the reason why it didn't work in the States. Is it guaranteed that the Democrats will keep winning forever? No. But I think we've got to build new narratives. And I keep coming back. I mean, I said that word very early on. What we tried to create in the story of the Green New Deal, and it is a story, and an ongoing story, is a narrative about a process of change, which is about making sure that we as people, as families, as communities, as regions, as countries, can survive this process of change, which we are going to have to live through in a way that is the best possible that we can to achieve the best possible outcome for us all that we can hope for. Most people don't like change. I mean, I do. I love change. I'm told that's pretty unusual. But overall, most people are very reluctant to change. So we have to provide people with stories that explain why this change makes sense. And the reality is that these stories work just as well with the wealthy as they do with everybody else. So do I believe at the end of the day they're going to buy into it? Yes, I do. And where is the process going to have greatest impact? Where is the biggest pressure going to come from? The finance sector, because they are terrified that their ability to make money is going to disappear unless they follow this. That's why the financial markets are the people who are driving change at the moment into companies, not the companies themselves, not the airlines, not the manufacturers, not anybody else, but the people who invest in them are. And the campaigns to disinvest in carbon, to get out of fossil fuels and so on, are really, really having an impact, and they're being noticed by the finance sector. So yeah, I believe it's possible.
All right, we're running out of time. Do we need a decrease of GDP to tackle climate crisis, and wouldn't that mean an increase of unemployment?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, let's be honest, let's replace GDP with a better measure of what is human well-being. But do we need to reduce human well-being? No, there is no limit to the amount by which we can care for each other. There is no limit to the amount which we can teach each other. There is no limit to the number of songs we can sing to each other, or the poems that we can write for each other, or whatever other art form it is that we want, all of which add to the sum total of human activity, all of which are gainful employment. No, absolutely not. We just have to choose what is the right thing to do. But in particular, we face AI, and AI is real. Artificial intelligence is going to change the nature of some jobs, without a doubt, and maybe reduce carbon output as a result. But what does that let us do? These things which are more fun, and these things about caring and education, which we have ignored for too long, where we should be doing things better. So no, this isn't a way to actually say we need unemployment. This is a thing to liberate us to work in better ways for the future. I believe this is an opportunity, not in any way a threat.
All right. This is a very good question, but follows. As someone who is unfamiliar with, but interested in economics and money theory, what literature would you recommend? Very interesting discussion, although I had to Google a few terms. Thank you, Mr. Murphy.
Look, actually, where would I suggest you start? Go to my blog, and I offer a download, and it was on the blog yesterday, I think, of an ebook called Money for Nothing and My Tweets for Free. If you're of a certain age, you will, of course, recognize that as a very close relation to a Dire Straits lyric. But the book is there. It's actually literally is tweets, almost all of it. From November through to March, I wrote some very long Twitter threads, up to 80 tweets long. Now, nobody should read 80 tweets. Nobody should write 80 tweets in one Twitter thread, and nobody should read them. But one of those threads has been read 1.75 million times now. So something must have been okay about it. And I put them together as a free download book, which introduces many of these ideas. Now, of course, that's not pure economic theory, but it will get you into some of the thinking I'm talking about. After that, you should be reading this book. It is Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. Is it perfect? No. Is it focused on the US? Yes. Is it going to, however, broaden your mind about these things? Definitely. I think that is your next stage. Then Kate Raworth and the donut ideas. If you're really going into economic theory, look at somebody like Steve Keen. But that's quite hard. People like that. But start with my book. You can look at my book, The Joy of Tax, if you're in the UK. It's not very relevant in Germany, but this definitely I recommend. But I recommend it so much, I'm on the back cover.
All right, the last question. I don't know if we want to go into this. And we'll leave it as the last question because we're already half past. Can you expand on the role of Bitcoins shortly?
I can explain Bitcoins very shortly. They're a fraud. That's it. I just don't believe they are anything but a fraud. Try to work out the double entry of Bitcoins. And actually, And I've done this with Isabella Kaminska, who runs FT Alphaville, who I get on with quite well and I do stuff with every now and again. We could work out single entry for Bitcoins and we can work out triple entry, but we can't work out who gets the benefit of the creation of the Bitcoin, who gets the credit. And we didn't know, and we can't know. Underneath Bitcoin is a missing double entry. And to me, that spells something is very wrong and potentially fraudulent. I don't trust Bitcoin. I don't trust other such things. I believe they're akin to Ponzi schemes. I think they're very dangerous. I would never go near them. They are not the future of money, nor, come to that, are the ledger systems, because they are not, as people say, oh, but they're open ledgers. No, they're closed ledgers. You can't track, actually, transactions through them, certainly as most of them stand now. So I really, really think they are dangerous to society. They're dangerous to investors, and I would steer clear of them as fast as you can. They are not an answer to any known economic problem that I'm aware of, but they are wonderful for those who wish to partake in speculation, who are willing to lose everything they've got, because that's what you might do.
Not to mention they produce an incredible amount of CO2.
Vast amounts of carbon for absolutely no net gain to society whatsoever. The equivalent of the output of the Netherlands, I think it is, to create Bitcoin, let alone other ones. So absolutely socially destructive in that sense as well. Just don't go near them.
All right. Then let's stop here, as promised, half past. Richard, thank you very, very much. This is also a moment of great satisfaction for me, because when a few years ago, Helle Panke asked, you know, would you like to do a series of talks, which then became Economics Beyond the Swabian Hausfrau?
Yeah.
The suggestion I made was Richard Murphy and the Green New Deal. And the answer was, the green what? And I knew it wasn't going to fly, so we didn't do it. But it's, yeah, 4 years later, 3.5 years later, it's really very, very pleased that, you know, we've gotten to this point. And thank you for your time. It was excellent. Listen, one thing I forgot to say, and I'll get in real trouble if I don't, is here at Helle Panke, they have a PayPal possibility. So if you wish to donate and support talks like these, then go there. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention. By the way, for those of you who it may have all been too much and too fast, it takes about a week, and then we have, or Helle Panke has it on YouTube in both versions, the English and the German. So you can, you know, go through it again. And, you know, if there's terms you don't know, you can Google them then. Don't feel like you're stupid because you do it. I do it constantly, and I read this stuff every day for hours, and I still have to go back and find certain terms. It's completely normal. Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian. Thank you, Mona. Thank you for your translations.
Thank you also, Florian and Monica. And we have a break now until the autumn. So hope to see you all again then.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you. Bye.
Good night.